Oyster shells into Charlotte Harbor today to help boost water quality and help our fish and anglers.
Picture a dump truck backing up to the edge of the Gulf of Mexico and tipping its load straight into the water. Not once, not 100 times, over and over, for more than a decade. What's inside isn't toxic waste. It isn't concrete rubble. It's garbage from restaurant kitchens, the leftover shells from every oyster po' boy and raw bar platter served across Florida. Environmentalists called it a scam. Fishermen called it a death sentence for the seafloor. And for the first year and a half, nobody could prove either side wrong. Then something started growing down there that nobody, not the biologists, not the skeptics, not the state officials who signed off on it, expected to see in their lifetimes. By the time this video is over, you'll understand why marine scientists are now calling shell waste one of the most quietly powerful tools in coastal restoration, and why it took a near catastrophe to prove it. Before we get into it, if you're into stories where nature does something science didn't see coming, hit subscribe, drop a like, and tell me in the comments, would you trust a plan this unconventional? Now, let's get into it. To understand why anyone would dump 500,000 tons of shells into the ocean, you have to understand how badly Gulf Coast oyster reefs had collapsed. Oysters aren't just a seafood staple. They're what biologists call a foundation species, an organism that entire ecosystems are built around, the way a keystone holds up an archway. Historically, the Gulf of Mexico supported oyster reefs covering enormous stretches of shallow water, layered structures built from centuries of shells stacking on top of each other. By the early 2000s, most of that was gone. Between overharvesting, coastal development, pollution runoff, and disasters like the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, researchers estimate the Gulf Coast lost somewhere in the neighborhood of 85% of its historic oyster population. That number is almost hard to process. Imagine a city losing 85% of its buildings and trying to function as if nothing happened. Meanwhile, there was a second, completely unrelated problem. Mountains of discarded oyster shells piling up in landfill. Restaurants shuck millions of oysters a year, and virtually all of those shells, which happen to be exactly what baby oysters need to grow on, were getting bulldozed into the ground with the rest of the trash. Two broken systems. One, glaringly obvious, deeply unproven idea. What if the waste from one problem was the solution to the other? Starting in the 2000s, Florida agencies, working with university researchers, conservation groups, and coastal counties, began building what would become one of the largest shell recycling and reef restoration efforts in the country. Restaurants started separating their shells instead of tossing them. Volunteers hauled them to collection sites after curing outdoors for months to kill off bacteria and remaining tissue. The shells were loaded onto barges and strategically placed on the Gulf floor near places like Cedar Key and Charlotte Harbor. On paper, it sounds almost too simple. In practice, it was controversial from day one. Environmental groups worried that piling shell material onto the seafloor could smother whatever fragile life was still clinging to the sediment below. Commercial fishermen, many of whom had worked those same waters for generations, were openly skeptical. They'd watched other well-intentioned coastal projects fail before, and they weren't eager to see their fishing grounds used as a test site. The scientists running the program weren't exactly brimming with confidence either. Artificial reef and shell-based restoration projects elsewhere had shown that results, when they came at all, usually took years to materialize, if they materialized at all. Nobody was promising a miracle. They were hoping for something modest, maybe a slow uptick in oyster settlement, maybe a little more structure on an otherwise flat, sandy bottom. What actually happened blew past every conservative estimate. Here's something almost nobody thinks about when they picture restoring a reef. The most important part of the process is invisible to the naked eye. Within days, not months, days, of shells settling on the seafloor, bacteria began colonizing their surfaces, forming thin biofilms across the calcium carbonate. These films are the biological equivalent of laying groundwork before construction starts. They transform a bare shell from inert debris into a living surface other organisms can actually use. At the same time, something interesting was happening chemically. Oyster shells are made largely of aragonite, a form of calcium carbonate that slowly dissolves in seawater, subtly shifting the water chemistry right around the shell's surface. Those micro-conditions happen to be exactly what many marine larvae, barnacles, tube worms, and, crucially, juvenile oysters respond to when deciding where to settle and grow. In other words, the shells weren't just providing a hard surface. They were chemically signaling, "Settle here," to drifting larvae across the reef site. Within weeks, diatoms and microalgae moved into the biofilm layer. Tiny grazers followed to feed on them. Those grazers attracted the first juvenile fish. Step by step, an entire miniature food web assembled itself on a pile of restaurant trash, long before a single fish big enough to catch showed up. This is the part traditional monitoring often misses, because it's not dramatic and it's not visible from a boat, but it's the reason everything that came after was possible at all. To understand why the shells mattered so much, compare them to what was there before. Bare, sandy Gulf bottom. Sand offers essentially nothing for marine larvae to grip onto. No chemical cues, no stable surface, no shelter from currents or predators. Oyster larvae, called spat, drift through the water column for roughly 2 to 3 weeks before they need to find something solid to attach to permanently. If they don't find it in time, they simply die. For decades, huge stretches of Florida's coastal floor had become what researchers sometimes describe as an ecological dead end, biologically capable of supporting life, but structurally offering it nowhere to start. The shells broke that cycle. Each mound became a concentrated landing zone for drifting spat, positioned in the paths of natural Gulf currents. And because oysters are self-building organisms, living ones cementing themselves to dead ones, generation after generation, a shell drop wasn't just a one-time fix. It was the seed of something that could keep growing on its own, indefinitely, without another dollar of human investment. That distinction is what separates oyster restoration from almost every other kind of artificial reef project. Sink an old ship, or a pile of concrete blocks, and you get a fixed structure that slowly degrades over decades. Seed a shell reef successfully, and you get a structure that can expand and repair itself for as long as the water quality supports it. The scientific data was one thing, but the moment this project really entered the public conversation was when the people who'd fought hardest against it started changing their tune. Charter captains and commercial fishermen across the restoration areas began reporting something they hadn't seen in years: dense schools of redfish, sheepshead, and other game fish stacking up around the new reef structures. Species that had become scarce in these waters started showing up regularly enough that some of the loudest original critics of the program began requesting new reef deployments near their own fishing grounds, the same agencies they'd once opposed in public meetings. That's a remarkable reversal. It's one thing for a research paper to report a statistically significant increase in biomass. It's another for a fisherman who's worked the same water for 30 years to say, unprompted, that he's seeing something he's never seen before. Researchers studying the fish populations around these reefs made a point of distinguishing this from a simpler, less impressive phenomenon: fish aggregation. Sink a shipwreck or a pile of rubble almost anywhere, and fish from the surrounding area will often relocate to it, not because there are more fish, but because there's suddenly somewhere better to hide and hunt. Survey numbers go up, but the total population of the region hasn't actually changed. What made the oyster reefs different is the strong presence of juvenile fish, animals that were born and reached maturity in and around the new reef structures themselves. That's a signal of genuine production, not just redistribution. The reefs weren't just relocating fish that already existed elsewhere in the Gulf. They were creating conditions that let new life survive to adulthood that otherwise wouldn't have. Here's a fact that tends to surprise people who've never thought much about oysters. A single adult oyster can filter somewhere around 50 gallons of seawater a day, pulling out excess nutrients, suspended sediment, and bacteria as it feeds. Multiply that by a reef containing hundreds of thousands of individual oysters, and you get something that functions, in practical terms, like an industrial water treatment plant, except it needs no electricity, no maintenance crew, and no budget. It runs itself, around the clock, for free. This matters enormously in the Gulf, where decades of agricultural and urban runoff have loaded coastal waters with excess nitrogen and phosphorus, the fuel behind harmful algal blooms that can cloud the water, starve it of oxygen, and occasionally trigger mass fish die-off. As reef sites matured, researchers and local observers began noticing something the models hadn't fully anticipated. Clearer water didn't just help fish. It let sunlight penetrate deeper, which allowed seagrass, a critical nursery habitat for juvenile fish, manatees, and sea turtles, to spread back into areas that had been too murky to support it for years. And seagrass, once established, does its own filtering work, stabilizing sediment, and further reducing turbidity, which in turn makes room for still more seagrass. One restoration effort had inadvertently kicked off two overlapping feedback loops, each one reinforcing the other, both radiating outward, well beyond the boundaries of the original shell drops. Every restoration project eventually faces a test it wasn't designed for. For Florida's reefs, that test arrived in the form of hurricane season. The Gulf Coast, and Cedar Key in particular, has been repeatedly battered by major storms in recent years, including catastrophic hurricane seasons that caused tens of millions of dollars in damage to the region's aquaculture industry alone. But here's where the reefs proved their second major value. Living oyster structures function as natural breakwaters. Their dense, irregular, three-dimensional shape absorbs and disperses wave energy before it reaches the shoreline, in much the same way a seawall or rock revetment would, except it's alive, self-repairing, and gets stronger over time instead of weaker. Concrete cracks, steel corrodes, rip-rap shifts and settles. An oyster reef, by contrast, responds to storm damage by triggering fresh larval settlement in the disturbed areas, effectively healing and rebuilding itself season after season. Traditional shoreline armoring can cost hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars per mile to install, and requires ongoing maintenance. A living reef, once established, keeps working without another cent spent. It's worth being honest here. Not every claim floating around online about these projects, like precise dollar figures for storm damage prevented, comes from rigorously peer-reviewed sources, and some of the more dramatic statistics you'll see in viral posts about this topic should be taken with a grain of salt. But the underlying mechanism, that healthy oyster reefs measurably reduce shoreline erosion and wave energy, is well documented in coastal engineering and restoration ecology research going back decades. What started as a contested experiment in Florida didn't stay in Florida. Similar shell recycling and reef restoration programs have since taken hold across the Gulf Coast, in Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas, often supported by federal funding aimed at rebuilding oyster populations that have declined by the vast majority of their historic numbers across the one. Outside the Gulf entirely, the Billion Oyster Project in New York Harbor has applied comparable principles to one of the most heavily industrialized, degraded urban waterways in North America, working to rebuild oyster reefs that all but vanished from the harbor more than a century ago. The core idea connecting all of these efforts is what some researchers call circular restoration. Instead of treating shell waste as garbage bound for a landfill, treat it as raw material for rebuilding the exact ecosystems that produced it in the first place. It's cheap, it's low-tech, and, as Florida's coastline has shown, it can outperform far more expensive, engineered alternatives. The most striking thing about a well-established oyster reef isn't what humans build, it's what happens after they stop. Once a shell drop successfully seeds a self-sustaining oyster population, the reef doesn't need another delivery of material to keep growing. Each generation of oysters that lives, reproduces, and eventually dies leaves behind a new layer of shell for the next generation to settle on. Vertical growth, horizontal spread, entirely self-directed. That's a fundamentally different model from most environmental interventions, which typically require continuous funding and maintenance just to hold ground against ongoing degradation. Here, the intervention is front-loaded. Get the shells in the right place, at the right density, in the right currents, and biology takes over from there. None of this means oyster shell recycling is a cure-all for coastal decline. Water quality, salinity, disease, and storm frequency all still shape whether a given reef thrives or struggles. Restoration ecologists are careful to note that results vary significantly by site, and not every shell drop turns into a thriving reef. But the broader pattern, waste material becoming the foundation for a self-sustaining, storm-resistant, water-filtering ecosystem, has proven consistent enough that it's now standard practice in coastal restoration circles from the Gulf to the Northeast. What's genuinely remarkable about this story isn't a single statistic or a single storm. It's the shift in thinking it represents. For a long time, restoring nature meant heavy engineering, concrete, steel, permits, machinery. What Florida's Oyster program suggests is something almost the opposite. Sometimes the most effective thing you can do is get out of the way, hand the ecosystem the one missing ingredient it can't produce on its own, and let it rebuild itself on its own terms. The shells didn't force anything to happen. They just gave the Gulf somewhere to start. So here's the question worth sitting with. How many other waste products sitting in landfills right now are actually the missing piece of some ecosystem's recovery, and we just haven't figured out where to put them yet? Let me know what you think in the comments. And if a story like this is worth your time, there's another one waiting on your screen right now.